Good morning. Jerry, thank you for that. Good morning. What'd you get up? You got up at 4 this morning, didn't you? That's why you have all the energy. Nice to see everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Allison, Barb, the chair of Sagamore Institute, and we're so honored and pleased to have you participating with us today. I'd like to thank my fellow board members who are here also. Thanks for joining us. And I want to give a special thanks to our Sagamore team, who under the great leadership of Teresa Lubbers, show up every day to propel our mission forward. So how about a round of applause for our Sagamore team? Yes, could I have people maybe move closer forward? I got one taker, Teresa. It is like church. No offering today, although you can donate to Sagamore, so there is that. We want to thank our sponsors today, One America Financial, Indiana Wesleyan, Cook Medical, and Hirons. Thank you to our partners for being a part of today. For the past 2 decades, Sagamore has been committed to moving ideas into action for the purpose of building a better society. As an action-oriented think tank, we choose to admire solutions rather than problems, and we partner with problem solvers. You're going to meet some of them today. We gather annually at this conference, Indiana's Conference on Citizenship, to celebrate exemplary citizenship and to highlight individuals and organizations that contribute to the greater good of our state, the Midwest, and the nation. We believe that our nation was founded on the idea that citizens, individuals would be at the center of the American experiment. That means that citizens need to be informed and engaged in our democracy for it to survive and thrive. To that end, our Conference on Citizenship focuses on that timely and important topic. Maybe you figured out today's topic. This year, we've chosen to focus on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, with an eye toward America's next 250 years. You'll have the privilege today of hearing more about this topic from one of America's most respected thought leaders on the enduring principles of the founding documents. You've all made several attempts to get here from Washington, D.C., but because of the snowstorm, he was unable to get here, and he'll join us virtually. Today's program is designed to jumpstart Sagamore's focus on the 250th throughout our entire year of 2026. Thanks to each of you for being here as an important part of this conference. I'm a former school teacher, so you do have homework. In your program, you have a card, and it says, how are you planning on putting citizenship to work this year? Today, would you think about that? Would you take time to fill out this card? Just one thing. You've seen some ideas already started on the screen today. And then will you hand it to our team when you leave so that we can share these ideas and hopefully encourage and inspire other people to understand that every act of citizenship matters. Small acts make big impacts. We're delighted today to begin our program with Indiana's 51st Governor, Eric Holcomb. He'll share some important issues and thoughts about this historical celebration. A lifelong Hoosier who studied U.S. history at Hanover, has signatures of 44 presidents, all of them, all of the presidents of the United States. Eric's life has been one of public service. Served in the Navy, served nobly for many elected officials, then became an elected official as our lieutenant governor and our governor. He's got a reputation of being a problem solver and putting people first. I've had a front row seat of watching Eric in action. His determination of putting people and their success before his own. When I was chancellor of WGU Indiana, Eric did all the visible things that were important, spoke at commencement, served on boards. But when nobody was looking, he would stop by our booth at the state fair every year to thank our faculty and inspire students. When I was president of the Fever, Eric came to our games during our rebuild seasons, which means we lost a lot. He'd wear his Fever jersey, and every night of the draft party, no matter where he was in the country or the world, Eric would find time to pick up his phone and call New York City and talk to the fever draft pick to welcome them to Indiana. No governor in the country did that, but Eric always showed up. But maybe my favorite example of Eric prioritizing people is how he treated our great Aunt Nell. When he was lieutenant governor, he awarded her the award that senior citizens get for service, the Golden Hoosier Award. And every time we would see, after that, every encounter, Eric would always ask me about Aunt Nell. And one day I was at the residence, it was her birthday, and I said, "Oh, Eric, it's Aunt Nell's birthday." And he said, "I have to jot her a note." And he takes the napkin off of the cookie. I was using the napkin to hide the fact that I was sneaking a cookie out of the residence to take home to Aunt Nell. And he jotted her a happy birthday note to a 94-year-old. Eric demonstrates at every turn that people are the most important thing, and he puts them first. He understands the value of prioritizing them. Eric's a leader, he's a problem solver, he's a visionary, he's a citizen, and he's a dear friend. Please welcome Eric Holcomb.
Good morning. Thank you, Allison, for bringing me back to earth with that introduction. It's so good to be with you all this morning, and it's been a good day already. My suit coat matches my suit pants. I did it all by myself. My schedule is a little different than it used to be, and I feel fortunate to be included in today's festivities. I also want to thank Teresa specifically, and Jay, and everyone at the Sagamore Institute for putting this together and taking the year to recognize what took 250 years to get to. And I'm going to, right out of the gate, break the first rule of public speaking, and that is to never sell yourself short. But we're all in for something very special today, a real treat with Yuval Levin being with us. Today has got nothing to do about me, despite Allison's build-up there. Yuval is uniquely qualified to inspire, and I'm looking forward to that portion of the conference. You simply couldn't have anyone better. It'd be like if we were talking college football and you had Coach Kurt Signetti here. What an authority, what an influencer on where our country's not just been, but more importantly, where we're going. In his latest book, as many of you I'm sure have digested and devoured, American Covenant, he offers not just clues, but actually cures to what is ailing our nation. The diagnosis is obvious. We are living in a time and a place of great divide, of gridlock, of stalemate, of just simply not being able to get many of the big and important things wanting to be done. And in response to that, Yuval very eloquently lays out a reminder about, again, where we came from, are these constitutional habits that were formed, which includes robust competition of concerns, of ideas. It includes negotiating across our differences. It includes, in fact, actually embracing what he calls this productive tension between opposing views. He points out ultimately, should be of no surprise, that by actually practicing these things, negotiating, thoughtfully debating, practicing these habits, it makes us stronger on the other side. We have a better chance of renewal and in accomplishing those big and important things wanting to be done. Just imagine what they faced 250 years ago. I look out at this crowd, and it was already mentioned, this is like church, so I feel like saying, can I get an amen? Like this is like But it is time, I think, for us, for Americans, especially when I look out and see the pews, those of us who are in positions of authority and influence and leadership, to stand up and to be counted on for acting out these habits, to speak up whenever and wherever we find ourselves, to demonstrate it through our actions. Actions and words have consequences. We want them to be good. As Allison was ticking that off, I'm reminiscing about our administration and our partners in the General Assembly, about all that we accomplished. It was a record I'm quite proud of. And I think about what we would have sacrificed, the gains that would have been sacrificed had we not quietly, but very deliberately practiced these constitutional habits. They became part of us. They were ingrained in our culture. Because we know, I'll just be honest and throw it out there, we know in a state like Indiana, and there are others, you can very easily ignore minority of thought and get by with it. I think in the short term, I think that is selling yourself short, ultimately. I think you can get by with ignoring the minority of others' minds. I think about the constructive debate that we had internally and externally on issues of public education, public health, all the differing views, all the negotiation, all the intersection of those in service and those we were serving. And because of that, what was forged, what the ultimate product that came from those habits, came something with credibility, came something with durability, something that would last. Again, I nod to our founding fathers and mothers some 250 years ago. And by the way, again, once you start ignoring those differing opinions, history shows us that you tend to start to just tune out or turn off constructive criticism. And that leads to a decay of what I would say a especially tragic sort. On the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, we have some folks with us here today who have been recognized because of their conduct, because of their virtue, because of the way they lived their life and brought it into the public arena. They exemplify these constitutional habits of democratic life and an extraordinary commitment to good citizenship and service. This formality that I allude to started back in the 1940s, 1945 to be exact. Mark Lubbers will know it was then Governor Gates, many of you probably do as well, who started this idea of conferring what's called the Sagamore of the Wabash Award on Hoosiers of all stripes, not just in the public square, people in arts and sports and education and business, and the list just goes on and on and on. And that impressive list of Sagamores of the Wabash, suffices to say, is an impressive one, and have given so much to the life of our state and where we find ourselves in ways that continue to endure. The Sagamore Institute, wisely, launched an effort called the Sagamore, the Society of the Sagamores, to tap this incredible experience of its namesake award. Some of you all are here today, and I would just ask you to please rise if you have been conferred with this award so that you can be recognized again. Wow. That means you too, Ann. I know. Thank you. And as I mentioned, the Sagamore Institute has this society now, so you're warned, you may be put to use. That wisdom is going to be used. And now, on another item, before we get to the main act and what Allison mentioned, and I haven't spoken about this publicly yet, but this time and place simply was too tempting to let it go. It seemed like such an ideal venue and theme as a backdrop. Again, I think I'm preaching to the baritone section of the choir when I mention this, but our state of the nation, which rises and falls on our respect for these constitutional habits and overall quality of our citizenship, no matter what year or season we find ourselves in, has been on my mind a lot. Maybe it's because I've had more time to putz around. And I've decided to do something about it from my little perch and focus more on the early years, on the front end, if you will. And a crew of like-minded individuals have come together and formed an institute, a policy institute called A Better Way. And I hope the name tells you more about the game, A Better Way. And it is working on the shoulders of a giant like Jim Ditto here, and on much of the hard work that's already gone into it with AIM, with the Sagamore Institute, in reaching into our high schools, whether it be in Richmond or Avon or Mishawaka or Fort Wayne, all over the state of Indiana. And we seek to elevate that even more. We're blessed in Indiana, you all know them intimately well, to have many organizations that foster these good traits and skills. And I think about these leadership organizations, counties have them. I think about Orr and Lacey and Daniels and Luger and on and on and on. A Better Way Policy Institute is going to seek to complement them all again at an earlier time when some students just don't have that access to the training that is necessary that will feed into this continuity of leadership development. And so we'll set sail on this and seek to build out these youth council networks in high schools across our great state, and making sure that these students are equipped to not just be part of, but influence and direct where our nation is going. Now, on to the main event. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you all two individuals that I'm sure that are going to inspire us with their thoughts, with their conversation about citizenship and our constitutional habits and much, much more as our nation does indeed approach this 250th birthday. Nate Feltman, the CEO of IBJ Media, who publishes the Indianapolis Business Journal, an indispensable journal for us all to consume. But I also want to give Nate another title when I think about him beyond friend, and that's Indiana's Renaissance man. He is, you know this if you know Nate, he is equally at home in business ventures, the media, and in his public life throughout the years. He makes everywhere he serves better in each of these domains, as an investor, as an employer, as a source of ideas and new ways of thinking and approaching new initiatives to implement and execute upon words and actions again. So thanks, Nate, for being the leader of today's important conversation. And I've already said a word or two about Yuval Levin, but now let me share the nitty-gritty. Yuval is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. If there's a resilient exemplar of America's civic and intellectual virtues in Washington, D.C., then it is surely AEI. And they are fortunate and they are wise to have Yuval. He's the author or co-author of more books than I can name right now. A founder and editor of the journal National Affairs, a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a frequent opinion writer at the New York Times. In the months ahead, as our nation reflects on our past 250 years, Yuval Levin will be a very busy man, in demand, and truly a source of inspiration. You're about to see why. We're fortunate to have them both. Nate and Yuval, over to you.
Okay, you all can hear me. Yuval, I think you can hear me. I see you on the screen in front of me. First, I want to say, Governor Holcomb, way too kind of an introduction. Thank you, and congratulations on your new institute. And I know all of us here will be excited to see that come to fruition, to grow. So congratulations, and we look forward to seeing that bloom and blossom. So, Yuval, I couldn't be more excited to begin this conversation with you. And we're sorry you can't be here in person, but I know a once-in-decade storm has hit the East Coast. So we'll be delighted to join you virtually, and I think everybody can see you. I can see that they can. Yuval, I brought a copy of your book, which Governor Holcomb just discussed, called American Covenant. And for those of you that have not read it, I know you will. It's an incredible book, which I recommend to everyone. I read it thoroughly, and I took all I had a whole bunch of yellow note. You can actually see it here. I've got notes and dog-eared pages and underlined. Incredible book. I'm thrilled to get to talk to you, Yuval, on America's 250th birthday. I also have the great privilege of serving as the chairman of the board of the Liberty Fund, and I want to thank Yuval for collaborating with the Liberty Fund through the years. Another can't miss thing that you need to listen to is a podcast with my fellow board member Mitch Daniels at the Liberty Fund that Yuval did with him on his Future of Liberty podcast. And I know you've collaborated with Law and Liberty through the years with John Grove and Brian Smith. So I want to thank you for that continuing collaboration. But let's get right to it, and let's learn from Yuval on incredibly important topics that I know you all are interested in, ideas to improve our civil society and the functioning of our republic. So I want to jump in with you, Yuval, and talk about, of course, topics that are covered in your book, American Covenant, how the Constitution unified our nation and could again. And it's that last piece, could again, that I know you're going to focus on. But you posit a view, Yuval, that our Constitution should be seen as a solution to finding common ground in increasingly polarized times. Can you just give us a little bit of a basis for that point of view as we get started in the conversation?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having this event. I really wish that I could be there in person. Indiana really punches above its weight when it comes to the civic work that's involved in keeping our country strong, and it's an honor to be with you even in this remote and virtual way. And I appreciate the attention to the book and to its argument. The book really does begin from the premise that the American Constitution is in part intended to address exactly the kind of problems that we face now, problems of division and social breakdown in a diverse society. Those problems were very much on the minds of the authors of the American Constitution. We often think of them as much more unified and singular than we are, but actually that generation of Americans understood themselves as divided in some very important ways. They were less culturally diverse than we are, but they understood themselves as religiously diverse in very profound ways. They were regionally divided in ways that went even deeper than we now think about. There were intense political ideological divisions. And one of the big worries that they came in with, one of the reasons why they thought we needed a constitution in 1787, was that it was going to be enormously challenging to hold this kind of society together. The United States in 1787 was already larger than any of the European nations. And of course, it was going to grow, and they knew that. And it was a society that was going to need to find a way to handle its own internal diversity and divisions. And one of the reasons for the American Constitution is to address that problem. It was a problem that was especially on the mind of James Madison, who more than anyone in that generation thought about the challenge of division and the danger of social breakdown. And what they ended up producing, the Constitution they created, is ultimately built around an understanding of what unity can be in a free society that I think is very important for us to grasp. It was not utopian. It was not built on the notion that this country could all come to agree. That's not what unity means. It was built on a very, very sophisticated understanding of how a diverse free society can hold together. Madison says very plainly, in a free society, people aren't going to agree. And I think any of us who have ever been part of any group project can agree with him that if you get a bunch of people together, what they're going to do is not all share one opinion. And yet the fact that we're not always going to agree doesn't mean we can't be a unified society. And for me, really at the center of this book is an idea of unity that says unity in a free society doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. This is Madison's core insight. It's possible to act together even when you don't think alike. How? That's what the Constitution exists to answer. How do we act together when we don't think alike? So it's very important for us now to see that, because that's the problem we face in 21st century America. We're divided and diverse, but we have to act together as a society.
Well, that's a great, Yuval, that's a great place for us to spend a little bit more time on because you've touched on this topic. You note that unity does not, in the book, does not mean that we have forgotten how to agree, but that we have forgotten how to disagree. That we no longer spend time as American citizens in active disagreement with others. You say we've forgotten the practical meaning of unity, that in the political life of a free society, unity does not mean thinking alike, like you said. Unity means acting together. And you note that the Constitution has three modes to deal with with differences among the public, and that's competition. Governor Holcomb referred to this: competition, negotiation, and productive tension. Talk a little bit more about those three ideas in terms of how we as a society can remember how to disagree civilly.
Yeah, thank you. I think you start that question in a great place, which is that we incline to think in a time like this, when America feels divided, we incline to think we're just disagreeing too much. And I think when you look at the thinking of the framers of the Constitution, you realize that, in fact, in some ways, the problem we have is actually almost the opposite of that. We're not disagreeing enough. The way forward in a divided society is to disagree, is to deal with each other directly, to engage with each other. And in 21st century America, the nature of our political culture, of our technologies, of our media, give us all ways of avoiding dealing with people we disagree with. And even those of us who are very engaged in politics now, we don't actually spend a lot of time engaged in active disagreement with people on the other side of questions that matter to us. We spend all of our time with people we agree with, talking about people we disagree with. On Twitter or on cable news, we lock ourselves into cocoons surrounded by people who have the same opinions we do, and we spend all our time talking about those terrible other people. What the Constitution says, when you step back from it and think, what is this trying to make me do? It's trying to get us to deal with those people rather than just talk about them. And everything about the system is built to facilitate engagement and deal making and negotiation and bargaining. And as you say, ultimately, it comes down to these three ways of dealing with differences that the Constitution embodies. One of them is competition. Sometimes the way to deal with differences is just to put options in front of the public and say, okay, here's the case for mine, here's the case for his, make a choice. That's what elections look like. It's also very often what the relationships between the branches of our government look like. It's what our culture looks like and our economy looks like. If you think about what the First Amendment to the Constitution is for, it's to facilitate the competition of ideas, religious ideas, political ideas. The entire intellectual life of our society is fundamentally competitive, and the Constitution exists to secure that. But at the center, the core way of dealing with difference is really bargaining and negotiation. The first branch of our government is Congress. What happens in Congress when it's working is bargaining and deal making and negotiation. Representatives of the different factions of our society come together in one place, and the institution facilitates their dealing with each other. My voters need this, your voters need that. Let's come to an agreement. That kind of coalition building and negotiating is really the core civic function of a free society. It's losing that knack, I think, that makes us feel like we've lost the ability to live together. And that really is about disagreeing more, not less. It's about engaging on those differences and finding ways to act together through them. The Constitution forces us to do that. It's frustrating. We don't always like it, but it is the only way through our differences and toward common action in a divided society.
I'm gonna come back, Yuval, in a little bit to the topic you just touched on, which is I'll just say a dysfunctional Congress today. But talk a little bit more about that. But before I do, you mentioned, of course, founder James Madison, and you talk about this in your book. He was very, very concerned about the threats to unity and social cohesion, and he wrote about that in quite a lot of detail in the Federalist Papers, including his concern about factions and parties. And a lot of us in this room, I know, have studied that. But he also talked about something that I know Sagamore is particularly concerned about, and that's the virtue of the civic virtue and the importance of civic virtue. In Federalist 55 specifically, he talks about that. I'm curious to ask, when did America, if we did, have civic virtue, and as a country, some ideas of how we might get back to that point?
Yeah, thank you. My way of thinking about the Constitution is very Madisonian. This book has a lot of Madison in it because I think that Madison, really uniquely among that extraordinary generation, had a sense that the big challenge was this challenge of cohesion and of civic virtue. You find a lot of people in that generation who fall into the kinds of political categories we know now. Some people who care about social justice and equality. Thomas Jefferson talks that way a lot. Some people who care about social order and dynamism. Alexander Hamilton thinks in that way. Madison almost uniquely thinks about social cohesion and unity. And he understands that what's required for that is a kind of civic virtue. That is an ability to play your part in a free society, to take responsibility and ownership for the fate of that society. This language of civic virtue is really worth thinking about for a minute, because there's a way that we sometimes fold it into the language of virtues in the plural. And the framers of the Constitution, the founders of the country, did talk a lot about virtues, some essential virtues, honesty and decency and responsibility. Those are important. But they also use this term virtue in the singular in a way that I think is really worth our working out. Because it seems to me that very often what they meant by virtue in the singular is something I would define as the strength to play your part. Our society gives people roles, right? We all have them. We have roles in our families, in various institutions. We have roles in our politics. Each of us is a parent, a neighbor, a worker, an employer, a citizen, maybe a participant in politics. Those roles, they come with privileges and advantages. They also come with heavy responsibilities. There are things you have to do because you're somebody's father or mother, because you're somebody's boss or employee. Those kinds of roles demand a lot of us. And the strength to meet those demands, to do what's required, is what civic virtue looks like. Civic virtue is the strength to meet the roles you have in society. And the most important role, and really on this point, Madison, like George Washington, is very explicit. The most important and difficult role in our politics is not president, and it's not congressman, and it's not judge. It's citizen. The core job is the job of the citizen. And that job comes with obligations too. And it's not just voting. It's not just turning out on election day. It's really playing a part and taking ownership of the challenges that confront your society. It's seeing this society's future and saying, this is our future, and I have an obligation here. And stepping up and playing that role. And civic virtue also does demand that we be able to listen to people we don't agree with and think about how we can work things out together. That's a very hard thing to do. It doesn't come naturally. It requires formation and education. It requires civics, a sort of conception of why this matters. And if we're capable of that, then we're capable of living in a free society. Ultimately, a free society doesn't just let us do whatever we want. It also demands of us that we do it responsibly. We can only remain free as long as we remain responsible. And the capacity to do that is what civic virtue ultimately involves.
There's a great line in your book, Yuval, that's right on this topic. And the quote from your book is, "A nation that gives citizens a lot of freedom requires a lot of responsibility from them." And that's what you just described. And I really love that line. It hits home. But I want to talk a little bit maybe about one way that possibly we're seeing a resurgence. I want to get your opinion on this, and that is the importance of civic education. We are right now seeing a resurgence of programs. Of course, Sagamore is deep, delving into this space, of course, but we're also seeing this at colleges and universities. Our governor just talked about a new program that he's working on with high schools in Indiana. I'm curious from your perspective, is this a short-term reactionary? Certainly public colleges are maybe being pushed to move in this direction. Some had started before being pushed, but is this reactionary and or in short term, or does this have possibilities of some long-term opportunities to improve the education of our citizenry long term?
I really have a lot of hope about this. It certainly is reactive in some ways, but that's okay. It's reactive to pressures that are healthy and necessary. And sometimes you have to push people into doing the right things. That's especially true about academics. I think the notion that pressure from the legislature or the governor is somehow illegitimate in a public university is kind of strange. A public university was created by legislators and a governor for a reason that's a political reason in the highest sense. And I think some of the pressure that we see now that's driving the creation of schools of civic thought and various civics institutes in public universities is very, very constructive. And some of those that have gotten started over the last few years strike me as very constructive and productive. They're working out well. You see that at Arizona State, in Texas, Florida, and North Carolina. You see it at Purdue, where I think they're doing some very important things for the civic formation of their students. It seems to me that civics ultimately is an absolutely essential function in a free society. It's particularly in a free society where the government doesn't tell people what to do, that it's important that people have a sense of what they ought to do and what their responsibilities are. More freedom means more responsibility, not less. And so that means that this extraordinary achievement that we call an American citizen is not just a natural phenomena. American citizens don't just grow on trees. They have to be created. They have to be created by a tremendous amount of social effort on the part of American society, and that has to start early. It has to start in K through 12 civics education. It has to extend into higher education. It has to extend beyond that too. We all have to keep learning about how to be an American citizen. And I think if the 250th anniversary becomes an opportunity to advance that idea, if just political pressure, if just having, a president who wants to push the universities around is turned into an opportunity to advance the civic educational function of higher education, I think that's tremendously promising and hopeful. And the motives behind it are ultimately civic motives. I think the means so far are serious, intellectually serious academic means. And I have a lot of hope for these programs. I hope they expand and grow.
Thank you. I do want to turn you all now to the legislative branch and some of the challenges there. It's an important piece of your book where you delve in depth on this front. And you note that our founders structured the Constitution in such a way that doing nothing is preferred, of course, over enacting aggressive policy programs by narrow legislative margins, which, of course, is what we have seen happen the last couple of decades. Talk a little bit about why you see these failures occurring, and what we can do to address and move in the other direction, and hopefully therefore turn down the temperature of our politics.
Yeah, I think this is a very important thing to see about the American system. It's actually different even from many other democracies in the modern world, from the parliamentary systems that we find in Europe and Asia and Latin America. The American system doesn't allow narrow majorities to govern on their own. Majority is not enough, and there's a reason for that. The fundamental purpose of our government, and it's stated clearly in the Declaration of Independence, is to protect the rights of the people. Now, we're all equal, and so the only way to govern ourselves is through majority rule. But that majority rule has to act in the interest of protecting our rights. That's a very complicated problem because majorities don't always want to protect everybody's rights. Sometimes they just want their own way. So how do you find a balance between majority rule and minority rights? In a lot of the world, parliamentary democracies lean heavily in the direction of majority rule and let little tiny majorities, you win a 3-seat majority in the House, and you control everything, the entire power of government. That is a way for majorities to roll over the rights of everybody else. In the American system, if you win a narrow majority, you have a lot of work to do before you can really run anything, because the president is elected in a different way than the Congress, and each of the houses of Congress is elected a little differently, and each of them has different rules, and there's federalism. There's a lot in your way. If you just have a little tiny majority, you've got to persuade a lot of people to go your way before you can get anything done. And that persuasion involves bargaining and negotiation. You don't just get your way. I think that is a profound source of wisdom in our Constitution, which says that our ideas will be improved through negotiation. They'll be made more tolerable, more bearable, more sensible, and ultimately better for the country. And now this is a source of a lot of frustration for Americans with the Constitution, because you win an election and you still can't do anything. You're still stuck with the people you just beat in the election. You got to work with them somehow. Every recent president has found himself in the Oval Office talking to the other party, thinking, why am I dealing with these people? I just won. Well, the reason you're dealing with them is that they won too. They won their own seats, and they have a place. Or what you win in an American election is a seat at the table. And what happens at the table is frustrating negotiation. That's by design. It's there to protect us all. And it's there to make sure that ultimately policy is made by broad coalitions. The system always wants to tell us, broaden your coalition. Now, in the last generation or so in American politics, we've tried to ignore this. We've only had narrow majorities. This has been a period of very close elections since about 2000. We've basically been at 50-50. And rather than take a hint from the Constitution that says broaden your coalition, you can do better than 50-50 if you negotiate, if you appeal to more people. Instead, we've said, well, we got 50% plus one person. Let's roll over the other party. Let's try to break the rules. Let's try to ignore the structure and logic of the Constitution and just get it done on our own. Whatever we can do in the next 4 years, let's pass all these narrow majority reconciliation bills and just do it ourselves. And then we wonder why it's not working. And we get frustrated at the Constitution. And we say, well, we need to change the Constitution. But actually, the Constitution is sitting there saying, no. The answer is build a broader coalition. Over and over, I find myself thinking the Constitution is the solution, not the problem. We shouldn't be banging our heads into it. We should be reading it and seeing its logic and broadening our coalition. There's no law of nature that says we have to be stuck at 50-50 for 25 years in the 21st century. We need political leaders who see that you win by appealing more broadly rather than just getting your most devoted voters out. And a lot of the incentives they face now lead them to be blind to this reality. The nature of the primary system, of political media, of social media, all lead us to think if we're just a little more pure, we'll win next time and these people will go away. The American Constitution is sitting there saying, these people are not going away. Find a way to broaden your coalition. I think that's as true as it's ever been.
Thank you, Yuval. So, I noted in your book, maybe sometimes some of us, and even maybe from a civic education perspective, we don't do a great job on this front in terms of what the framers thought about the different branches of our government. A lot of people are under the assumption that they envision three co-equal branches of government, which is absolutely. You reminded us in your book that is not the case. That you note that Congress was the preeminent institution. They're closest to the people. That's what the framers had in mind. And you note that Congress has really abdicated that responsibility. And as a result, the president's powers, the executive branch, has grown immensely as a result of that abdication. Talk about this failing from a congressional perspective, and what could be done for what could Congress do to begin to take back some of that power?
You know, co-equal is my trigger word. It's the idea that we have three co-equal branches was basically invented by 20th century presidents to justify their assertions of power. The Constitution does not create three co-equal branches. Congress is first, and it's first for a reason. If you think about how the Constitution is written, it could have been written in a way that says these are the powers of the national government, and these are three branches. But it's not. It's written in a way that says these are the powers of Congress. All of the powers of the national government are listed in Article 1, Section 8 as powers of Congress. And then there's an executive branch to carry out the laws that Congress passes and a judiciary to interpret those laws. Congress is first and foremost. That's because it's closest to the people. It's because it's the place where it's actually possible to act together when we don't think alike. That's where bargaining happens. The president's one person. There's no bargaining within one person. There's bargaining in a plural institution. And that's ultimately where American government should be centered. The trouble we have, of course, in our 21st century politics is that Congress itself has decided to pass along a lot of its power especially to the president. And when there are conflicts between the branches, Congress itself sits back and says, well, let's see what the courts decide. The fact is the Constitution wants Congress to assert itself in these situations and to set the direction of our politics. There's an important role for the president. There's an essential role for the courts. But Congress has to play the leading role. And when it doesn't, it creates a dangerous vacuum that invites presidential overactivity, that invites judicial overreach. So even in this moment where a lot of our politics basically consists of watching these titanic struggles between the president and the courts, we have to recognize this is happening because Congress has created a vacuum. And the dysfunction there is the source of a lot of our challenges. And the only way to really address these problems is for Congress to see its way to reasserting itself. That's going to require changing the incentives that members of Congress face. We've seen effectively in Congress in the 21st century the replacement of the separation of powers with something more like the separation of parties. Members understand themselves first and foremost as belonging to a political party, and if the president is of that party, then they serve the president. That's not how Congress is intended to work. And I think that there are ways of changing some of the procedures and structures and rules of Congress to give members much more of an investment of their own ambition in legislative work, to allow the committee system to matter more, to decentralize power so that it's not just four people, just the party leaders in Congress running everything, but individual members can have real power. I think the 21st century Congress has a lot to learn from our state legislatures about how legislative work can happen successfully. And we really are in a moment that demands a period of congressional reform and reassertion. That's a lot of my day job now, and I think it's important for anyone who worries about the Constitution.
I would expect that you might have been a little heartened by this recent Supreme Court decision on tariffs.
Yes.
I say that because Justice Gorsuch,
Mm.
when I read some of the reporting on Justice Gorsuch's concurring opinion, I thought he must have read Yuval Levin's book. He must have read it because you know he talks about that the legislature is the bulwark of liberty, just as you're describing. He calls on them to do their job and not to cede power, certainly the power to tariff to the president. There's a great quote from Gorsuch's concurring opinion. It says, "It can be tempting to bypass Congress when some pressing problem arises, but the deliberative nature of the legislative process was the whole point of its design." I thought that sounds like a line right out of Yuval's book, right? I'm betting we're going to see some quite dramatic, interesting. Tonight's the State of the Union, of course,
Right.
at 9 p.m. And I'm thinking of those justices sitting right in front of the president. I'm imagining we're going to see some interesting pictures and our president going after some of these folks. But did it give you a little bit of hope when you saw Gorsuch
Yeah,
pushing back?
I was very glad of the decision, and absolutely that very part of Justice Gorsuch's concurrence. The last paragraph, you don't have to read it all. The concurrence is all very interesting, but the very last paragraph of Gorsuch's opinion is just that. It's a statement of the centrality of Congress in our system. And I think it's enormously important. I agree. It's going to create a lot of drama. I mean, tonight the president will confront the other two branches. They'll just be sitting right in front of him, and it'll really be something.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody early this morning, and I said I think it's going to be a little bit like watching a car wreck tonight. I can only imagine what the president will say, and then how the justice will be sitting there straight
That's
faced.
right.
So
Not allowed to answer.
you're right, right. So I want to talk a little bit again about the wonderful the framework our founders put together, and they were afraid, as we're talking about the preeminence, their idea of the preeminence of Congress. They were actually afraid that the legislature could become too powerful,
Yes.
and therefore we're of course concerned about the separation of powers, and of course the opposite has happened, as we've just talked about. And you write, the American presidency is now likely the single most divisive facet of our politics. And it, like this, it's an incessant and inexhaustible fountain of tribalism and disunity. Talk about, and we just, of course, touched on the rising power of the presidency, but it sounds like you have a little bit of opinion on that, on that front based on that quote.
Yeah, and it's not just one president or another. We've gotten to a place now where, because of the willful weakness of Congress, our presidency is much too central to our politics. And what happens when that happens is the temperature of our politics rises way too high because the president is one person and a presidential election is one choice. And if it seems like that one choice will determine everything about our politics, the whole direction of our government, everything depends on who wins this one election, that unavoidably raises the stakes of that election to a place that can't help but divide us intensely. When we think, well, if this one election goes the wrong way, then everything I care about is going to get undermined, then our country inevitably gets more divided. And the trouble is that is increasingly true. Right? The only way to change people's impression that the presidential election is an everything election is to change the reality and to create a situation where Congress matters more, and therefore a presidential election, while it's always going to be very important, isn't the absolute be all and end all of American political life. The only way to do that, to lower the temperature of our politics, is to reassert Congress's role in the system. And so to create a little more stability, a little more stability across election cycles and over time. That can only happen when policy is made by law, by statute, and therefore where we don't end up with a situation where every new president spends half of his term undoing what his predecessor did and the other half doing all kinds of things that his successor is going to undo. That is an unstable political life, and that's been our situation now for more than a generation.
Right. So I want to stay on this topic of on the presidential executive branch and talk a bit about the Electoral College. We, of course, hear from time to time about calls. We hear calls to eliminate the Electoral College. You, of course, argue that would be a mistake and that the two-party system and the fact that presidential elections come down to 6 or 7 swing states today is not a bad thing. It's a good thing for national unity and competitiveness of our politics. So some of us might have the feeling that coming down to 6 or 7 states, swing states every time is not great. But tell us why you think that's not the case.
Yeah, now look, it's not perfect, right? And the question of political reform is always a question of compared to what. And when you think about the Electoral College, it's compared to a national popular vote. Now, the case for the Electoral College, I will tell you, having made this case for years on college campuses and elsewhere, is a hard case to make. People don't immediately see the logic of why our presidential elections shouldn't just be straightforward elections. But if you actually look around the world, there's almost no democracy that elects its chief executive directly. And in most democracies, in the parliamentary systems, it's actually much less direct than the Electoral College, right? The prime minister is chosen by a majority of the majority party in parliament. So in Britain, that's 250 people who all went to the same university and have the same political views choosing the prime minister. That's much less democratic than the Electoral College. We do it the way we do it for a couple of really important reasons. One is to make sure that our regional diversity is represented, which was very important to the founding generation and remains very important. Another is to make sure that the electorate that chooses the president is essentially the same one as the electorate that chooses Congress. So each state has an electoral college delegation that's the same size as its congressional delegation. But the most important thing for us in 21st century America is that the Electoral College makes sure that our presidential elections are decided near the ideological center of the country, right? If we had a popular vote for president, the parties would focus where their voters are concentrated. The Democrats would spend all their time in California. The Republicans would spend all their time in Texas. Why? Because there are a lot of Democrats in California and a lot of Republicans in Texas, and you just need to get your numbers up. What the Electoral College says is it doesn't matter how big you win in your best state. If you didn't win the most competitive states, then you didn't win the election. And what happens in those states is you have to persuade people who could go either way. Ultimately, to become president of the United States, you have to persuade a lot of people who might have voted for the other guy to vote for you. And that forces you to focus on the conceptual center of American politics, not just to get your most devoted people out, but to talk to people who aren't sure and say to them, I'm the right person for this reason and that reason. That's very healthy for our divided society. A direct popular vote for president in 21st century America would be extremely divisive. The parties would only talk to themselves. They'd retreat into those cocoons and get every last Democrat out in California, every last Republican in the South. Instead, they have to focus on people who could go either way. And I think that does a lot of good for our political culture. So the Electoral College serves a very important purpose that it doesn't get nearly enough credit for. And I think compared to a popular vote for president, it's a much better system and much better for the health of our democracy.
Yuval, you had hinted at challenges with our primary system in one of your previous comments, and you point out in your book that our primary system incentivizes candidates to essentially many times commit to not negotiating with the other party or bargaining with the other party, and therefore really not to do the job of a member of Congress, which is they're elected in the general election to do. Talk a little bit more about what's happening with our primary system, and I know you've got some ideas potentially how to improve.
Yeah, I mean, party primaries basically are a way to engage those most devoted voters. The party primary electorate is about 8% of the overall American electorate. That's a very small number of people in a huge country. And they're the people who are most ideologically devoted to their party, who are never going to vote for the other party. Those people don't want a politics of negotiation and bargaining, right? They just want to win. They want to see their side win as pure a victory as possible. And that means that if our politics begins by having to win a primary. It begins by having to promise never to give an inch, never to talk to the other side, never to bargain and negotiate. And of course, that's the job you're running for. So you're starting out by promising essentially not to do the job. I love political junkies. I'm one of them. I'm a primary voter, but primary voters are basically the craziest people in America, right? They're the people whose lives are politics. And so we start every election cycle by asking the craziest people in America, what would you like to see? And then doing that. It should be pretty obvious to us that that's not an ideal way to address our politics in a divided time. Now, I will say primaries didn't cause this problem, right? We've used primaries to choose candidates in elections for Congress for more than 100 years in most of the country, and for president since the 1960s. But although they didn't cause this problem, changes to primaries are essential to addressing the problem. One thing you learn in public policy reform is prescription is not diagnosis in reverse, right? You don't solve a problem by undoing what caused it, because you can't undo what caused it. What caused our political problems are all these vast cultural changes, technological changes that we're not going to reverse. So we have to ask ourselves, given where we are, what could we change that would allow our politics to be a better fit for our constitutional system and to hold us together better? I think some reforms of the primary system have to be part of that solution. And we have to experiment with reforms. We have a very decentralized election system in America that lets us try all kinds of things. At the state level, you can just experiment and see what works. I think, for example, that it's worth experimenting with ranked choice voting in primaries. I wouldn't do it in general elections. I don't think that's a good idea. But in primaries, ranked choice basically says, let's pick somebody who's going to be everybody's second choice. Well, that's actually not a bad personality type for the kind of person who can win a general election. And after all, the purpose of candidate selection is ultimately to let our party win a general election. The primaries don't do a good job of that. Both parties end up losing elections they could win because the primaries chose a candidate who's not broadly appealing. That just has to be overcome. The parties have to see their way out of that. And I think it's a time for experimenting with reforms of candidate selection around the country.
Thank you. I want to talk about the last chapter of your book, and that's entitled, What is Unity? And you note that we have something of an advantage over the framers of our Constitution in overcoming the temptation to vilify our opponents and dismiss them as anti-American. You say that we have a shared memory of a common national life that has now extended over 2.5 centuries, and we can fall back on our national experience, something our founders, of course, could not do. And you note our advantage is that we know their experiment succeeded, perhaps beyond their wildest expectations. Does that give you hope that we can improve our republic and bring down the temperature and improve our civil discourse despite the last few decades of the opposite?
Absolutely. I do have hope. This book begins in hope and ends in hope. I think, very simply, we're Americans. And so we have a lot of reasons for hope. Being Americans means we're very lucky. It means we're also very experienced in dealing with tremendous social challenges and political problems. And we have a lot to build on and work with. We have a political tradition that gives us some tremendous tools to work with for a time like the one that we face now. And we do have that advantage that the framers didn't have, which is we know what they did. We know that it worked, and we know what's happened since, and we know that we can do it. Look, many past generations in our society have dealt with problems that are much bigger than ours. Think about the challenges that the Americans who were coming to maturity in the 1920s and 30s faced. Think about the challenges that Americans faced in the middle of the 19th century. Think even about the enormous political violence and social division that America faced in the 1960s, when many Americans who are now alive can remember. Those problems were vast and immense, and ultimately our system allowed us to work through them by giving us the forms and institutions and habits that are required for citizens of a free society to take responsibility for their future. That's what's required of us. What's different about this moment is not that the problems are bigger, it's that they're our problems. And so the question is not whether the system can handle this. The question is whether we can handle this. And to do that well, we're going to have to know that system of government. We're going to have to know our history. We're going to have to be up to it. And we're going to have to take our obligations to our children seriously and recognize that what's required of us is not just some satisfying, victory in the next election. What's required of us is working together to own the future of our society in common.
Yuval, so of course we're celebrating the 250th anniversary, and Sagamore's theme this year is America's next 250. And you write in your book that our nation's founding deserves something more this year, the 250th anniversary, something more than candle slogans, and vague celebration. How are you hoping that Americans will honor this landmark?
My hope is really that what we do is something like this conversation. What we do are ways of thinking about our responsibility as citizens. There's always been something peculiarly kind of intellectual about American patriotism. We don't just celebrate. We don't just set off fireworks. We do those things, and we should. But the nature of our founding, and therefore the nature of our country, has always given us a lot to think about. It's given us a kind of measuring stick for holding ourselves to account. Are we living up to these ideals? Are we living up to these principles? I think those are the questions we have to ask ourselves in this moment. And so this should be a time for thinking about how our country can be better. And looking forward, as you say, to the next 250 is exactly the way to do that. It's to have a long-term view that lets us think about our past and use that to think about our future. The fact that our country has endured for 250 years is an extraordinary achievement. Ours is actually the oldest living democracy in the world. We think of ourselves as a very young nation, and in some ways we are, but we're not a young government. We're not a political experiment that just got started. We have a lot to show for ourselves, and I think learning from that experience and thinking about what it has to offer us for the next 250 years is exactly the way to think about this. Our politics needs to think about the future more, and not just the next election, but the next 250 years is the way to do that.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I think what I'll do is open up for a couple of questions. So think about a question that you might have for Yuval. Yuval, you came to America from Israel when you were a young child and became a citizen of this great country at age 19. So perhaps as somebody who had that experience as an immigrant coming to America, accepting the responsibilities and privileges that come with citizenship, how do you think, as an immigrant, and of course we're dealing with all kinds of issues around immigration today as a country. Talk a little bit about why that perspective may have given you more insights to the extent you can share, and what as a country we need to make sure we don't lose, as a country of immigrants.
Above all, my life experience has made me grateful for this country. And in a funny way, my everyday work now is basically full-time gratitude for America. It's a lucky place to be. As you say, I came when I was very young. I became an American citizen when I was 19. I was a college student. I took the oath of citizenship at the federal courthouse in Newark, New Jersey. And the elderly judge retired judge, I guess, who gave us the oath, after the ceremony, he kind of got up to give a speech. And my expectation was, I was already very much a political junkie and a history junkie and an American patriot. And I thought he's going to talk about Lincoln and Madison. And that is just not what he did. He got up and he gave a very short talk. And he said, from now on, you have to think and talk about America in the first person plural. And I had a card that they give you that day when you turn in your green card and get your naturalization certificate. And I had written on the back of it, first person plural ? I literally didn't know what he meant, but he told us right away. He said, what it means is you say we and us when you talk about America, not them and they. And those few words have stayed with me in such a powerful way over all these years since then, because it's exactly what we need to hear, not just we as immigrants, but as Americans, to be reminded that when we talk about this country, we have to say us and we. And when you see that, you realize we is actually an incredibly important word in the American political tradition. We is the first word of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States. It's the first word of that incredible second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. These are ways of talking about our shared fate as a people that start by reminding us that we're in this together. Like it or not, we're in this together. That's our strength, that's our weakness, that's our reality. And to start from that place and to be reminded of that in the moment of becoming an American citizen really had a lot to do with the direction my life has taken. So for me, it's all about gratitude for this country, which I think is where civic responsibility really has to begin.
Thank you for sharing that story, Yuval. I thought it's in the book, and it's a powerful story. So I would like to open it up for a couple questions if you're up for that, Yuval.
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
raise your hand. There's a couple already, and there's a microphone coming to you. So wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, Bree Sweeney. Thank you so much for being with us here today and just for the work that you're doing. My question to you is regarding what you had said about the legislative branch and how people need to begin appealing more broadly. Who does this well, maybe up and coming or already doing it, and who can we pay attention to?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question because I think in some ways this is the kind of missing ingredient in our politics in this moment. We've been, as I said, at 50-50 for 25 years in American politics. And the fact is, it just doesn't have to work that way. I think it's absolutely possible for a political leader, a political party to win big in contemporary American politics by appealing past the usual lines and trying to build a broader coalition. You can't win 80% of the vote, but you could win 60% of the vote. That would be a huge victory in 21st century America. And it's not really how we work. I think there is a kind of model to look for. The type of political leader that has been able to do this in our history has been a person who has a lot of experience with the fact that not everybody in the room agrees with them. So if you think about some of the presidents who've built broad coalitions, it's been people like Franklin Roosevelt, who was a wealthy patrician of the left, and so just spent a lot of time in rooms where a lot of people thought he was crazy. Think about Ronald Reagan, who was a Republican in Hollywood, right? So he was used to people who didn't start out agreeing with him, and he knew he had to persuade people. Even just Bill Clinton, who was a liberal Democrat in Arkansas, right? So he always started out thinking, half this room thinks I'm wrong. How do I talk to them? That type is actually too rare now in American political life. The kind of person who has grown up, who has spent a life being in a lot of spaces where people disagree and building up the capacity to persuade. I think that's what I would look for now. The political talent to look for is a person who, in a room where everybody but one person seems to be nodding their heads, that person looks at the one and says, well, why is that person not agreeing with me? I got to go over and talk to her. That's what I've worked for a lot of politicians, and I would say the great ones work that way. They really want to persuade you. And so if you're looking at a politician, think, is this person trying to persuade people who don't agree, or is this person just trying to fire up people who do agree? There are some young, talented people. I would especially look for them at the state level. The politicians who have brought America out of ruts over and over. And if you think about the three examples I gave you, all of them were like this. They were all governors. Governors have to be realistic. They are the only sane people in 21st century American politics for a reason, is because they're actually held to account. And when things break down, they're the problem, right? I'm stuck at home in Maryland today because my governor is just not good enough at clearing snow. Well, that's a real test in the real world, and that makes people practical and prudential. And I think our way out of this will be led by governors and state legislators.
Wonderful. I know there's more questions. Please wait for the mic coming.
Thank you, Yuval. Excellent presentation. I'm Dr. Toby Malachi. They call me the Global Godfather, so I'll try to hang in with the Renaissance man, the IBJ, Nate. I'm a senior fellow here at the Sagamore Institute. I have a White House appointment. I've had it for the last 7 consecutive administrations. I just wrote an article that got a lot of attention on LinkedIn on tariffs. I'm considered one of our country's experts on tariffs for SMEs, for small, medium-sized enterprise, on trade. I predicted that back when I spoke at our Columbia Club back in August 21st, the IEEP would probably be knocked down by the Supreme Court. There's reasons for that. But one of the things I wrote about in the article, and I did tag Nate at the IBJ on that, if you got it or not, that I knew the president was going to come with what's called Section 122. And I said it'd probably come in around 10%. They said 10%. My prediction was that he's probably going to go to 15%, which he did. America, I think, doesn't quite realize how many tools the President of the United States of America really has at his disposal to get his tariffs through. There's still Section 301 and 322 coming up. My question is that what's being talked about now are refunds for those companies that get back. There's a major corporation, I think it's one of the first, has asked for a refund back. Indianapolis has a major hub for that corporation here by our airport, has asked for the refund back for one. I think it's going to be a challenge, particularly for SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, to get it back because we just don't have the legislative power to do it. My question is, do you think that the refunds that they're going to try us back, and President Trump's trip now to China is coming up, will that complicate his trip to tariffs going to China?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things about this. I absolutely agree that the president has a lot of tools, and that ultimately he's probably going to be able to reimpose a fair amount of the tariffs that have been overturned here. But it's still very important that the attempt he made to use emergency powers as a way to impose tariffs has been overturned by the courts, because the president's emergency powers are a particular source of extraordinary delegation of power from Congress to the executive, and those really have to be curbed. And again, this is not just about Donald Trump. All of our recent presidents have used their power to declare emergencies in ways that could not have been intended by the authors of the legislation that give them those powers. And I think it's very important for Congress and the courts to roll those back. And there are limits on the other things he can do. As you know, the tariffs he imposed now in their place are temporary. If they're not backed up by Congress after 5 months, they go away. There are other kinds of constraints he's going to face, and I think it's important for the president to confront those constraints and to see them and live by them. Ultimately, the question of refunds is going to be very, very complicated as a practical matter. And it's starting. It's going to be determined by the courts. The administration has said that they will abide by what the courts decide on this question. And I would not begin to guess. I'm sure you're in a better position than I am to guess about exactly where that'll end up. But I think it's going to take up a lot of time in the courts over the next couple of years.
One last question for Yuval, and there's a couple. There's one up here. I know. Right here. Oh, is there a student? Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a student in Wayne County, and I just you gave a story about your experience as an immigrant, and I was just wondering about your thoughts on the current treatment of immigrants in America.
Thank you very much. I think that there are two competing pressures here that our leaders have to find a way to balance. The first is that our society, like any society, has to have some control over who enters and on what terms. And so our borders cannot be open. There has to be a policy decided by our society through our political institutions that sets some terms for who can enter and in what ways. And it's very important that we bring that flow under control. And we've done very poorly at that for too long. I think it's important that the border be under control. At the same time, when we have those paths in that are determined by our political system, we also ought to be welcoming of the people who follow those rules and enter in those ways. The United States has always been a nation that has built itself up through new immigrants and their children and grandchildren. Just about everybody in our society is descended in one way or another from people who immigrated here. There are very few Americans now whose forefathers came on the Mayflower. Most of us are here because someone made a choice to come to America for a better life. And there are people around the world now making those choices. And as long as they follow the rules that we put in front of them, I think our society ought to be welcoming of them, ought to see them as assets and not as liabilities, ought to see them as having a lot to offer our society. And when we think about how to treat people in our immigration system, we have to understand that we're dealing with human beings who are created equal and who have come here for the same reasons that our parents and grandparents came, and who are seeking the same dream that our society offers. I think there has to be a fundamental humanity in the way that we treat them. And our country has not lived up to that in the last few years. So we do absolutely need rules. We need to enforce those rules. But when we do, we also need to see that the people involved are human beings. We can manage that balance.
Well, Yuval, I want to, on behalf of everybody here, just thank you for an incredible conversation. And you give us all hope, Yuval, and your work. I know all of us that have had a chance to read and study, certainly that you've done just that. And
Well, let me
I
just
know-
say thank you very much. And the work that the Sagamore Institute does gives me a lot of hope. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Let's give Yuval a round of applause. And I'm gonna turn it over to Teresa Lubbers, our president of Sagamore.
Thank you, Nate. Join me again in thanking Yuval and Nate. So as we conclude this year's Conference on Citizenship, we do so with such deep gratitude to Yuval, Governor Holcomb, and Nate Feltman. Could we have a more impressive group of people to talk about the obligations of citizenship? I don't think so. So thank you. This is especially important as highlighted today. Our system works best when people cooperate with respect when they disagree. As Yuval states with eloquence and conviction, compromise is a constitutional virtue, not a weakness. So, as often the case when we have events with Sagamore, we don't choose to do these as a singular event, but rather as a launch of other activities. So this is really the launch of the work that we're doing throughout the year to celebrate America's next 250. Indiana's commitment to pragmatic and community problem solving has served us so well in the past and will do so as we move forward as well. You will note throughout this year Sagamore's efforts to renew the American spirit and remind citizens of what must be done to continue this experiment in governance. One of the ways we will be doing this is, as Governor Holcomb talked about, through the Society of Sagamore Network. We are going to continue to reach out to people, and we've been very encouraged by our initial response. As you might imagine, it's not easy to find the Sagamores, but it's worth it to do it. Sagamore Institute proudly shares its name with the state's highest honor. In 2015, Sagamore hosted the first ever gathering of the Sagamore of the Wabash honorees. And much like the wise counsel provided to governors, we're building this network of honorees whose experience and expertise can inspire and teach the next generation, some of whom were represented here with us today. Our plan is to develop the Society of Sagamore into an active network of leaders investing in the next generation. And as we invest in the next generation, we'll increase our work with AIM, the organization that you know represents mayors. We have one with us here today. And really, in particular, with those 14 to 18-year-olds, the high school students. These councils are designed to equip students with the civic knowledge, leadership skills, and opportunities for service. And as Yuval mentioned as well, while we think fireworks on the 4th of July could be great, and it is an American tradition, Sagamore plans to also celebrate with the publication of a book that highlights our citizenship work, from revitalizing main streets to strengthening the Midwest industrial base to partnering with other organizations and leaders who share our dedication to preserving liberty. One of those partners is senior Sagamore fellow Joe LeConte, who is actually spotlighting Benjamin Rush. You may not know that name, but he's America's forgotten founding father and a signatory to the Declaration of Independence. And there's a new documentary that we've been putting out that traces his impact on democracy. This is just a mere sampling of our plans for the year, so stay tuned and stay current through our newsletter and other outreach efforts. Again, many thanks for joining us today. I know you believe it was time well spent, and we look forward to committing ourselves to renewing the American idea. Thank you and have a great day.